Welcome back to the channel, scholars. In today's video, we're going to be wrapping up our conversations about the ancient Greeks with probably my favorite of the three ancient Greeks that we're really focusing on, and that's Aristotle. We talked a little bit about Socrates, not too much. We got him mostly through the writings of Plato. We focused a good deal on Plato. We talked a little bit about Homer through the fundamental and absolutely amazing work of Book 9 in the Iliad. And now we're going to talk about Aristotle. Aristotle was Plato's student. So Socrates first, then Plato, then Aristotle. Homer was of a different tradition, a bardic tradition that existed much, much earlier. Aristotle lived from 384 to 322 BCE. He was not an Athenian, unlike Socrates and Plato. He was born outside of Athens and was sent to study at Plato's academy at a very early age. And what developed was an absolutely outstanding mind, a mind that some people would call polymathic. A polymathic mind is a mind that's like a genius's genius mind, like the genius of geniuses. Someone who's great at many different types of thinking. So Aristotle was a brilliant logician. He's incredibly good at logic. He was brilliant at psychology. He taught biology. He taught zoology. He was incredibly intelligent in terms of politics and ethics and philosophy. Just one of those people that's not good at even 3 or 4 things, but someone who's good at everything. So he was brilliant. He differed from Plato in certain important respects. Plato thought that the truth, with a capital T, existed outside of human experience, and that through conversation, through philosophy and through discussion, or what he called dialectic, which is the coming together of different viewpoints and different ideas in order to form a truer one. So if you imagine two things coming together and colliding and creating something new, right? That's the way that we get to something that's true. Aristotle thought that the real and the true existed in the world in which we live. So for him, understanding the material world, understanding the world of objects and people and things was essential to understanding what's real. And so if we want to think about it in modern terms, Plato, we might say, is the grandfather of philosophy. From him, all the different schools of trying to reason and philosophize about the real world emerged. From Aristotle, we get science, trying to understand the material world in order to better understand the world in which we live. They differed in other ways as well. At the time of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, there were another group of thinkers called the Sophists. S-O-P-H-I-S-T-S. S-O-P-H-I-S-T-S. Sophists. It's kind of a hard word to say. Now the Sophists were fundamentally concerned with the art of persuasion. How can we get people to believe certain things? One of the reasons why Plato and Socrates hated them so much is this very reason. They weren't concerned with what's really true in any given instance. They were only concerned with how do we get people to believe something. So what they were accused of is one day arguing one thing and the next day arguing the exact opposite thing. And so for people like Socrates, who was ultimately concerned with knowing what's real and what's true and what's getting to the truth, he looked at them as just tricksters and frauds, and so did Plato. Aristotle was a little bit different. He said, well, wait a minute. Let's really look at this here, because maybe there's something useful here. Maybe we can think about dialectic and rhetoric as working together in order to get to the truth. They're not totally separate forms of communication, but more they're sort of like your arms and your legs. They perform different functions, and you can get by without arms or without legs, but if you have both sets, you may potentially be more successful. So don't throw rhetoric out completely. Let's keep it, and let's see if we can adjust it a little bit in order to make it more attuned with the idea of finding truth. So that's going to bring us to the essential question that Aristotle raises for us. How can you discover the means of persuasion available for any subject or situation? In other words, if you're trying to persuade a given audience, what are the available means of persuasion you or the speaker can use given the subject matter? Now, there's a lot more variables there than what's the thing I need to say in order to win. Right? It's not that simple. What this form of rhetoric requires is logic, discovery, and evaluation. And I'll give you a more concrete example. Let's go back to Book 9. I'm sure everybody's dying to do that. Let's go back to Book 9 in the Iliad, and let's take the Sophists' strategy and potentially Aristotle's strategy. Now, the Sophist strategy might follow what Agamemnon did. They might think, okay, so there's poene, there's a poene. I don't want Achilles to stab me in the guts, so why don't I just ransom things off? Here, let me just give him a bunch of stuff, and that way I can win. They'd say, here, Agamemnon, say this, and you'll win. Aristotle would think about it in a completely different way. Aristotle would say, all right, what am I trying to do here? Well, I'm trying to win Achilles over. What are all the arguments I can muster to try to do that? And what will be the effect of each of these arguments given the situation, given my nature as the speaker, and given Achilles' nature as the listener? So again, this is focused on thinking things through very carefully and meticulously. It's focused on logic. It's focused on reason. And it's focused on knowing an enormous amount. So having a lot of knowledge and knowing a lot of information. It is in that way both moral and pragmatic. It's not just one or the other. It's not just useful and it's not just good. It's both of those things. And it's still concerned about what the best way of being successful is, but it's not sacrificing being successful for being right, and it's not sacrificing being right for being successful. So ultimately, what we're going to learn from Aristotle is that rhetoric is useful when you don't have perfect knowledge of the facts. Okay? When you're given a public speech, okay, one of the things that you need to be able to do is to be able to think critically about the thing that you're talking about, because many things aren't cut and dry simple. For example, in the United States, we constantly have debates and discussion about many things, but probably the two most recurring things are, what are we going to do about all these guns in our society, and what's the right stance on abortion? Right? These are not simple issues. In order to be able to give constructive and productive public speech on these issues, you've got to be able to think through both sides of the argument in order to give the most convincing presentation. In addition, Aristotle points out that rhetoric depends on enthymeme, E-N-T-H-Y-M-E-M-E. Enthymeme is a logical statement, like a syllogism is a logical statement, but it leaves out a singular term. Now, if that isn't totally clear to you, we're going to have our key terms up on the board in our next video, and enthymeme and syllogism are going to be defined, and we're going to go through them in greater detail in that video. So don't worry if that's not entirely clear. Just note that enthymeme in Aristotle's style of rhetoric, and in the style of rhetoric that we're going to be studying, is extremely important. In addition, Aristotle will point out in the reading that we're going to do that there are several types of speech. And each one of these types of speech is characterized by a different time, the past, the present, and the future, and a different set of important, let's call them things, okay? Facts, values, and future action. So, for example, he identifies one style of speech as being forensic. This is what you would see in the court of law. This is concerned with the production of facts and their explanation. The second style that he identifies, concerned in the present, is about values. This is about giving honor or blame to some person or something. So we might see this kind of speech at a funeral, at a graduation, at a wedding, in which you're extolling the virtues of the couple being married, talking about the grandeur of the accomplishments of the graduating class, or indicting some terrible behavior of past dictator or something like that, right? There are these kinds of value-laden speeches. That the kind of fancy Greek word for that is epidictic. The final type of speech that Aristotle identifies is what's called a deliberative speech. Now, this might be a type of speech that you would encounter in a government proceeding. What should be our future course of action given what we already know? And so you've kind of got to balance this idea of facts and values in a deliberative speech, and it's one of the reasons why Aristotle will hold it up as being the most, I think he calls it the most noble, yes, it's the most noble of the three types of speeches. And finally, what Aristotle is interested in outlining are the reasons why rhetoric can be important. So, if you remember your history, you remember that Socrates is ultimately forced to kill himself, right? Even though he may have been right, he lived his life in such a way that by the end of it, he was forced by the powers that be to end his life. Okay, so what Aristotle would say is, well, wait a minute. What we can do here is use rhetoric in order to defend ourselves, right? We might have the facts on our side, but if we can't deliver them in such a way that they're convincing and compelling and interesting, then they're in some ways worthless. So what he would say is, rhetoric is useful because it will help you to defend yourself. If you're being unjustly or maybe even justly accused of a crime, you can defend yourself. It will help to prevent fraud and injustice as well. So if someone is trying to engage in some sophistry and some fallacious argumentation, you can say, wait a minute. Let me tell you exactly why that's wrong, in points A, B, C, D, E, F, and boom, 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 and just demolish their arguments. So it will totally prevent, in Aristotle's estimation, fraud and injustice. It will aid in your ability to communicate. If you're eloquent in your ability to convey ideas, then there's literally nothing more powerful than that in our society. Think about the most powerful people, right? These people are extraordinarily good at communicating their ideas and getting people to follow them. So it will be extraordinarily useful if you're eloquent and powerful in your speech. So argues Aristotle, and I agree, very much so. There is nothing more powerful than a person who is very, very eloquent and successful with their speeches. Is it the thing that you should shoot for above all other things? That's up to you. But there's very few things that are more powerful than an eloquent speaker. And finally, what Aristotle would say is that this type of rhetoric will make you knowledgeable. Because in order to be an eloquent speaker, a truly eloquent speaker, you need to know the ins and outs of all the sides of the arguments that you would engage with, right? It's not just being right, and it's not just being eloquent. It's both of those things put together and seeing all of the different arguments that can come about with regards to a given topic, a given audience, and a given speaker. So in that way, you become extraordinarily knowledgeable if you study rhetoric. And it's one of the reasons why AP thought it would be an important class for everybody to engage in prior to going to college. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so excited to talk to you about it. So we are going to be reading Book 1 of Aristotle's Ars Rhetorica. We are going to keep this essential question in our mind. The reading strategy that I'm going to outline for you is to make it simple. Right? Try to make it as simple as you can. This is a very difficult read, and so what will help you is to try to simplify it. One of the ways that I tried to simplify it in this video is to go back to the example of Book 9 and look at the sophistry of Agamemnon's behavior along with what Aristotle might think about doing in that given situation using his rhetorical strategies. So what I suggest that you try to do is to simplify it by annotating in the text, and I certainly do that to a great extent, and applying examples, either ancient examples from Book 9 or modern examples. Any modern issues that can help provide context that are commonly discussed. One of the ones that we mentioned earlier was guns and abortion, but you can also think of free speech or LGBTQIA rights, etc., as a way of thinking these issues through, right? These complex issues through, given a more modern context. So take very copious notes. So take a lot of notes. Make sure you're writing a lot in your notebook. The questions that I'd like you to consider and be ready to talk about are: what are the two kinds of logical proof and how are they different? What are the three kinds of artificial, or perhaps a different word for that is artistic proofs? So what are the three kinds of artistic proofs? And then what are the three types of oratory and how are they different? We're going to pick up reading in Book 1 as soon as we get back, and I'm going to offer some terms and their definition in order to help that reading here in just a moment. Thank you very much for your attention. See you momentarily. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and dive in now to Aristotle's first book of the Ars Rhetorica. Keep in mind that you're going to need to be taking copious notes, a lot of notes, because this is quite a difficult read. Also refer back to the earlier part of the video where we introduced those questions for analysis. And of course, keep in mind the essential question, which is ultimately the question of rhetoric in general, which is: how can you discover the means of persuasion available for any subject or situation for a given audience and speaker? Now listed here are the vocabulary words that we're going to be going through. What I strongly recommend is that you're writing these down in a notebook. You can also annotate on the reading itself, though I strongly recommend taking notes in a notebook. And as we're going through, pause the video, of course, jot down some thoughts, jot down some ideas. I'm really eager to hear what your thoughts and your ideas are on these topics, as this is going to form the basis of our discussions going forward, because many of the things that we're going to be talking about are focused on rhetoric. So we're going to go ahead and dive in now. As we come to a vocabulary word, I'll gloss it verbally, so I'll go through it verbally, but then at the bottom of the screen you're going to see a definition. Please make sure you're writing those definitions down. Okay. Point one. Now remember, Aristotle is our great classifier. I call him sometimes the man of the means, or the great classifier, because Aristotle was all about finding the means between the extremes of two different things. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But more to the point on this particular reading, Aristotle is an incredible classifier. So you're going to see I, and then 1 and 2, and so on and so forth. Just keep in mind that those are different subsections of what he's going to be talking about, because he's very fastidious, he's very meticulous about his recording and his classification of different things. Keep that in mind. 1. Rhetoric is a counterpart of dialectic, which it resembles in being concerned with matters of common knowledge and not with any specific science. So already we've got 2 vocabulary terms here. Number 1, rhetoric. Rhetoric is the faculty of finding the possible means of persuasion in each particular case given a situation. Okay, so it's the ability of finding the means of persuasion. It's not just the art of persuasion, as the Sophists say in their definition of rhetoric. In Aristotle's definition of rhetoric, it's the faculty or the ability or the science or the art, as he calls it later, of finding the possible means. So if it's an art, it's going to have gradations. It's going to be a more refined ability for some expert rhetoricians, and it's going to be a less refined or less sophisticated form of rhetoric for other rhetoricians. In addition, we have the idea of dialectic. Now, dialectic to the ancient Greeks was kind of what we would think of as logic today, but I think another way of understanding it that might be helpful is thinking of it as 2 ideas that come together to form a more complete, unified idea. So 2 ideas synthesizing or coming together to form a more complete, coherent ideal. So if we think about it in terms of politics, let's say, the left wing, usually the Democratic parties, and the right wing, usually the conservative parties, form 2 different sides of this dialectical discussion. You need both sides, and together, ideally, they come together in a more complete, comprehensive understanding through logic and discussion. That's the ideal. So you can think about rhetoric as the art of public speaking generally, and dialectic as the art of logic generally, but more specifically, rhetoric is the faculty of finding the possible means of persuasion in each particular case, and dialectic is the faculty of finding the truth through logic and discussion. So, all of that in one sentence. Continuing on. Rhetoric is also an art, since it is possible to reduce to a system the means by which the rhetorician obtains success, so you can be better or worse at it. Previous compilers of arts of rhetoric have neglected enthymemes, which are the body of proof, and have confined themselves to appeals to the passions, which are irrelevant and only have the effect of biasing the judge. So here Aristotle is smacking the Sophists around a little bit and saying all they're doing is biasing judges and not necessarily focusing on logical proof, which we can find through enthymeme. Enthymeme is comprised of 2 parts: a premise or a starting point, a basic understanding, and a conclusion that can be drawn from that premise and an unstated or already understood premise. Now, let me give you a series of examples here for enthymeme and syllogism, and then later on for logical fallacy, which are going to focus on zoology, because that was Aristotle's specialty. Okay? We're going to say mammals are warm-blooded. Okay, that's our premise. It's our starting point. It's our universal understanding based on the terms mammals and warm-blooded, what we understand by those two terms. Therefore, so this is my indicator that I have a conclusion coming up. Therefore is a good conclusion indicator. Humans are warm-blooded. So mammals are warm-blooded, therefore humans are warm-blooded. Two parts. There's a part that goes unstated, however, which is that humans are mammals. Okay? We generally understand that to be true. Most people know that. If it was a surprise to you, then it's a surprise to you. But we can say in an enthymeme those two parts and leave that other part out. And that's generally what you'll find in rhetoric. That setup. A syllogism is a little bit longer. That's the two premises and a conclusion, which are mammals are warm-blooded, humans are mammals, therefore humans are warm-blooded. That's the three-step, enthymeme is the two-step. Aristotle is saying that if you're going to engage in rhetoric as he's understanding it, you need to understand the enthymeme, because logic is essential if you're going to be performing rhetoric correctly. Otherwise, Socrates and Plato are totally justified in saying that rhetoric is just chicanery and tricksterdom, right? It's just magic tricks. They're just tricking you, because it's not really the truth. It's just they're playing with words, and then they're convincing you of something, even though it may not be true. As he says, all it would do is have the effect of biasing the judge. Moving on. Second paragraph. So a lot in that first paragraph. Second paragraph. Although deliberative oratory is nobler than forensic, men prefer the latter because it offers more opportunity for irrelevance in chicanery. So chicanery, as I said, is trickery. We'll talk more about deliberative and forensic oratory later on. He'll define those in greater terms, but I think what he was just doing here was just to start to introduce how earlier rhetoricians, the Sophists, are primarily using rhetoric. They're using it in the courts, and they're using it for trickery. Okay. Third paragraph. The rhetorical, as contrasted with the strictly scientific method of demonstration, is the enthymeme, which is a kind of syllogism. Therefore, one who is thoroughly acquainted with the nature of the logical syllogism will be most likely to prove a master of enthymemes. So go back and look at those definitions of enthymeme and syllogism again, familiarize yourself with them, look up other examples of them, and keep the example that I brought up in mind. Next paragraph. However, notwithstanding the unsatisfactory nature of previous arts, rhetoric is undoubtedly useful. So again, this is where he's going to start to talk about the usefulness of rhetoric, which we talked about previously in the earlier part of the video. When the truth and justice fail through inefficient advocates. So when truth fails because you're not articulate enough to proclaim it or to describe it, rhetoric is helpful. That skilled rhetorician will set this right. It enables a man to state his case in popular, not scientific language, which would be unintelligible to some hearers. So here he's saying, hey, some people aren't going to understand all the scientific jargon, so it's useful to be able to communicate in such a way that multiple different types of audience are going to be able to understand what you're saying. So it's important to keep your audience in mind. 3, it enables him to prove opposites and to refute an opponent who makes an unfair use of arguments. Now, an unfair use of arguments could loosely be defined as a logical fallacy. So I'm going to give you an example of a logical fallacy, and let's see if you can spot it. Mammals are warm-blooded. Therefore, birds are mammals. Okay, that's the Enthymeme version. Say it again. Mammals are warm-blooded. Therefore, birds are mammals. Now, if you couldn't catch it in the Enthymeme version, let me say it in a syllogistic version, and I bet you'll be able to catch it. Mammals are warm-blooded. Birds are warm-blooded. Therefore, birds are mammals. Did you catch the trick there? The trick is that just because mammals are warm-blooded and birds are warm-blooded does not mean that birds are mammals, because it's saying if A, then B. It's not saying if B, then A. So because we're inverting those terms, it's not logically consistent. It does not work out. So it's what's called a logical fallacy. And logical fallacies are many in kind. We'll talk about them in greater detail in later videos and in class. But keep in mind that what it is it's using arguments unfairly or inaccurately. 4, it provides an efficient defense of yourself. Remember, we used the example from Socrates earlier. If it be objected that it does much harm when unfairly used, this applies to every good thing except virtue. 2, his second point. A lot already, even in the first point. Rhetoric may be defined as the faculty of discerning the possible means of persuasion in each particular case. So there's our definition of rhetoric again. These consist of 2 proofs which are inartificial, or what I might call inartistic. And if you'd like a set of examples for that, it comes all the way at the end of this essay. So go ahead and glance at that now if you like, and then we'll come back here in just a second. But inartistic, which might be thought of as evidence. So you can see 15. The other type, 2, is artificial, or what I would call artistic. The latter are 3 kinds. Here's Aristotle, the Great Classifier. Ethical, derived from the moral character of the speaker. The fancy Greek word for this is ethos. Ethical. Emotional, the object of which is to put the hearer into a certain frame of mind. The fancy Greek word for this is pathos. Emotional, how the hearers will feel. And the third, logical, contained in the speech itself when a real or apparent truth is demonstrated. The fancy Greek word for this is logos, or logos. So ethos, pathos, logos. We'll talk more about those as time goes on. Just store those definitions in your mind now. The orator must therefore be a competent judge of virtue and character. He must have a thorough knowledge of the emotions, or passions, and he must possess the power of reasoning. This being so, rhetoric must be considered as an offshoot of dialectic and politics, including ethics. There are 2 types of logical proofs. Deductive, which is the enthymeme, and inductive, which is the example. Deductive reasoning is like logical reasoning. You're figuring things out through a series of steps. Inductive reasoning is like scientific reasoning. You're setting out a series of examples, studying them, and coming to a common understanding based on those examples. Enthymeme is a rhetorical syllogism. Example, a rhetorical induction. Rhetoric does not consider what is probable for individuals, but for certain classes of individuals, and derives its material from the usual subjects of deliberation, which are necessarily contingent, for no one deliberates what is certain. So these have to be arguments about what is still uncertain. Rhetoric can't be focused on what we already know, because there's nothing to discuss. Hence, enthymeme and example are concerned with things which, generally speaking, admit of being otherwise than they are, which means that they're debatable and potentially ideological topics that need to be discussed. Enthymemes are formed from probabilities and signs. Signs are of two kinds. One, necessary, or tekameria, and two, unnecessary, which have no distinctive name and are related A as particular to universal, or B as a universal to particular. The example defined. Enthymemes are of two kinds. Those are deduced from one, general truths, or two, special truths from general to special topics or commonplaces. So this is giving a very broad definition of enthymeme as being two-part syllogistic statements that include a premise and a conclusion, and a part that is supplied by the audience. There are three kinds of rhetoric corresponding to the three kinds of hearers. For the hearer must be either 1, a judge of the future, 2, a judge of the past, 3, a mere spectator or critic of the orator's skill. This is then the deliberative oratory, the epideictic oratory, and the forensic oratory. Or as he says here, hence the three kinds of rhetoric are deliberative, forensic, and epideictic. Okay? The business of the deliberative kind is to exhort or dissuade, its time the future, its end the expedient or the harmful. Of the forensic, to accuse or defend, its time the past, its end the just or unjust. Of the epideictic, praise or blame, its time the present, sometimes the past or the future, its end the noble or disgraceful. We went through this a little bit earlier on in the video. I would recommend going back and looking at that discussion in order to better understand what these three types of oratory are. But very briefly, what I can just run through is that forensic is based in the past, deliberative is based in the future, epideictic is based in the present. Each one is focused on a different style of oratory based on justice, based on praise or blame, or based on what we should do about our systems, our organizations, and ourselves in the future, how we should behave going forward. And so when you can deliver speeches like this, you can get people to think a certain way about the past, behave a certain way in the present, and then furthermore behave in such a way in the future to continue that system of behavior that you've already kind of laid out. So again, being a powerful orator is one of the most powerful things that you can be. All orators must, in addition, have ready for use a stock of propositions relating to the possible and the impossible, to the truth or the contrary, of a past or a future fact, to the great and small, and the greater and less. Beginning in paragraph 4, or IV4, deliberative oratory deals with contingent things, not with all, but only with such as are within our control. That which necessarily happens or cannot possibly happen is not a subject for consideration. That is to say, what deliberative oratory focuses on is that which is upcoming, but not that which is not going to happen or not subject for consideration. So things like the government, science, the economy, all of those are within our purview, and those consist of what we can do within the future. Should we allocate money to this? Should we research that? Should we establish policies that allow for this? And so on. Those kinds of discussions that happened in a public forum, like a Senate, are what are called deliberative oratory. Its most important topics, as Aristotle goes on to enumerate, are 1. Ways and means. How can we spend our money? How can we conduct our business? War and peace. Defense of the country. Imports and exports. Legislation, such as voting and passing of laws. Paragraph 5. The aim of all men is happiness, which is the subject of all exhortation and dissuasion. Definition of happiness. Its components are noble birth, many and good friends, wealth, the blessings of many and good children, a good old age, health, beauty, strength, stature, athletic skill, a good reputation, good fortune, virtue. I'd be interested to see what you have to say about this particular paragraph, whether or not you disagree with it or you agree with it. But one thing that's totally clear is that Aristotle loves his categories, but I'd be interested to see if you disagree or agree with his categories. Paragraph 6. The special end of deliberative oratory is that which is expedient. Expedient means useful, valuable, worthwhile. And since that which is expedient is a good, he must establish the general principles of the good and the expedient, the definition of the good, indisputable and disputable goods, the greater and less degree of the expedient good. The deliberative orator must also be acquainted with the different forms of government. We might call this a politician, or at least a politically wise person, maybe even a political scientist. Democracy, oligarchy, aristocracy, monarchy, the ends of which are freedom, wealth, education, in accordance with the Constitution. An unrestricted monarchy is called a tyranny, and its end is personal protection. Epidictic oratory deals with praise or censure, the objects of which are the noble and the disgraceful, virtue and vice. In discussing these, incidentally, the orator will be able to produce a certain impression as to his own moral character, the ethical kind of proof mentioned in section 2. That is to say, one establishes their credibility, their ethos, in delivering an epidictic oratory, like at a graduation speech. Who do you invite to a graduation speech? Well, you might invite someone who's accomplished something great. You might invite a very funny comedian. You might invite a successful politician. And so that reflects on them and their abilities. Right? They're there because of who they are as people, and we think of this as ethos. That's what he's pointing out here. The component parts of virtue are justice, courage, self-control, magnificence, magnanimity, liberality, mildness, wisdom, both practical and speculative. For purposes of praise or censure, qualities which are closely akin may be regarded as identical. We should consider our audience and praise that to which they attach special importance. We should think about who our audience is, and we should be able to praise that which they attach special importance. This is extraordinarily useful if you are going into politics. Think about how useful it is when trying to secure someone's vote to talk to them about things that they're interested in. Right? You cannot get someone's vote by talking against their interest unless they're crazy. And also endeavor to show that one whom we praise has acted with deliberate moral purpose, even in the case of mere coincidence and accidents. Praise and encomium differ in that the former commends the greatness of a virtue, while the latter is concerned with things actually achieved. So one has to do with character, and one has to do with accomplishment in rhetorical appeals. Perhaps you do want to appeal to someone's character and talk about how kind and funny and generous they are. Or perhaps you want to talk about instances in which they exhibited these qualities and why they're such important characteristics. It depends on the audience. It depends on the situation. Amplification also should be frequently made use of, and the person whom it is desired to praise should be compared with men of renown, or at any rate with other men generally. Amplification is most suitable to epidactic oratory, example to deliberative, enthymeme to forensic. So here he's laying out what to use when you're giving an epidactic oratory. You want to amplify, you want to exaggerate, you want to stretch as far as you can the appeal to the greatness of virtue or the greatness of the things achieved in order to achieve your ends, as long as you're not committing a logical fallacy. When you're delivering a deliberative oratory, which is that speech which argues for a course of forward action, you want to be able to provide examples. You want to be able to conduct that inductive style of reasoning in order to show, well, this is how we need to move forward based on these previous examples that are arrayed here, 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 and here. And enthymeme should be used when you're talking about forensic oratory. Not to say that you couldn't use example in forensic oratory, but you want to try to deduce what very probably happened based on the evidence at hand when you're talking about things in a trial or forensic evidence, because that's really what history boils down to. It's a deduction of what very probably happened based on the facts that you have at hand, because we don't have perfect knowledge of what happened in the past. So let's talk about forensic oratory here. Forensic oratory in paragraph 10 or X, which deals with accusation and defense, requires the consideration of 1. The motives and wrongdoing. 2. The frame of mind of the wrongdoer. 3. The kind of people to whom he does wrong. Wrongdoing is defined as voluntarily inflicting injury contrary to the law. This is where the Greeks differ from us a little bit, most modern countries. Wrongdoing in most modern countries doesn't have that idea of voluntary in there. You can still do wrong even if you're not voluntarily committing it. But for the Greeks, it was all about the direction of your behavior. Are you aimed at the wrong? And so I think that this is very interesting, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions on this. Do you think that wrongdoing is based on voluntarily inflicting injury contrary to the law, or can it be mere accident? A voluntary act is one committed with full knowledge and without compulsion, and as a rule with deliberative purpose. Do you agree or do you disagree? I'd be interested to hear what you say. The causes of wrongdoing are depravity and lack of self-control. Its motives arise from human actions generally, which are voluntary and involuntary. There are 4 causes of voluntary action: habit, reason, anger, and desire. Involuntary action, there are 3 causes of this action: chance, nature, and compulsion, or the absolute need to do it. The motives of the first are the good or the apparently good, and the pleasant or the apparently pleasant. The good has already been discussed. Oh yeah, he already talked about the good completely in 6 or VI, so you can go back and look at that if you need a little bit more clarification on the good. But I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about that. So that it only remains to speak of the pleasant. So let's talk about the pleasant, because he's got to define that now too. Definition of the pleasant, and a list of pleasant things. Oh, that's nice. He's ending on a high note. The frame of mind of the wrongdoer, and the classes of people liable to suffer wrong. Laws being special or general, so also are just and unjust acts, according as they affect the individual or community. Hence it is necessary to have an exact definitions of acts of injustice, because it often happens that a person, while admitting the commission of an act, will deny the description of it and its application. There are 2 kinds of rules in regard to just and unjust acts. We call these written, prescribed by laws, and unwritten, or not prescribed by laws. We would call these unwritten laws de facto. These are the unwritten. They exist in the very nature of the society in which you live. Right? De jure rules are rules that are set out by law. So one de facto rule might be that you should respect your parents, your brothers and sisters, and other people within your community. There's no absolute law that says you have to respect them, but it's accepted within almost all modern societies to respect your parents, your brothers and sisters, your children, and so on, your teachers. De jure rules are literal laws written into the constitution or the law books of the respective society that you're discussing. So a de jure law would be laws regarding murder. Right? It's illegal to murder someone. Right? So these are the difference between written, prescribed by law, de jure, or unwritten, de facto. The latter refers to the excess of virtue or vice involving praise or disgrace, honor or dishonor, and they supply the omissions, voluntary or involuntary, in the written law. This supplementary justice is equity, defined as justice independent of the written law. Equitable acts are such as may be treated with leniency, and equity considers the intention of moral purposes of the agent rather than the act itself. The degrees of wrongdoing. And then finally, we get to the end here where he starts to talk about inartificial proofs, which, if you remember, he mentions much earlier in section 2, where he talks about artificial proofs and inartificial proofs, or what I call artistic proofs and inartistic proofs. And basically what inartistic or inartificial proofs are, they basically break down into what we might think of as evidence. Now they range here in terms of their quality as evidence, but they would include laws, witnesses, contracts, torture, because at this time you could torture slaves in order to get a confession, and oaths. So these are types of evidence. You can't really craft them or adjust them in oratory. And so that brings us to the end of Aristotle's first book of the Ars Rhetorica. What I would like you to do is to make sure you have definitions for these words, as well as have answered the 3 analysis questions to facilitate the discussion in class of this complex, highly ordered, highly structured reading. I'm curious to see what your thoughts are on it, and I'm looking forward to discussing it with you. Thank you so much for your attention. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.